are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest is a friend of mine. We've known each other a long time. We share interests in a great many subjects, including among them politics and the long-term future of humanity. James J. Hughes. Dr. Hughes is, among other things, the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is an institution whose board I serve on, so that reflects our common interests. And James Hughes, known as Jay, co-authored a piece recently entitled Conspiracy Theories, Left Futurism, and the Attack on TESCREAL. We'll find out what TESCREAL is in a minute. But first of all, James J. Hughes, welcome to the Zero Hour, or welcome back, I should say.
Delightful to be here again.
Well, it's delightful to have you again. And I really wanted to talk to you about this piece. I was so glad that you guys wrote it. But before we start getting into the details of it, I'm going to guess that the majority of our listenership does not know what the acronym TESCREAL stands for. So why don't you explain that for us, if you would?
Okay, in a nutshell, Timnit Gebru is as a computer scientist who worked for a while on the Google ethics board, and then they had a confrontation and she left. And that was a couple years ago. And then Phil Torres is a person who's been associated with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies in the past, and who I've supported his work in the past. And he has hooked up with Ms. Gebru to work on attacking a nexus of ideas that they think are implicit in Silicon Valley or are somehow driving this is part of the question. What exactly are they saying? But they have come up with this acronym, TESCREAL, which stands for 7 different ideologies: transhumanism, extropianism, rationalism, etc., that they have encountered in their investigations of the power structure of Silicon Valley and the bad people. And their analysis is that this TESCREALism, this kind of bundle of toxic ideas, is somehow driving or making worse or something Silicon Valley and has to be attacked. And the reason that Eli and I decided to take this on is that we're both socialists and have been involved in debates in these fields. Myself, for 30 years, I've been a left-wing critic within the domain of transhumanism. I was therefore a critic of extropianism, which was kind of the libertarian flavor. And we found that this attack on TESCREALism smacked to us of a long history of left-wingers being attracted to conspiracy theories in lieu of an actual structural analysis and a good intellectual history that recognizes the actual complexity of how ideas work. And so that was what the point of the piece was.
Fair enough. And, I have seen some of their writing. I certainly recall spending time with Phil Torres. I don't know the person he's been writing with, and I'm blanking on her name now. I apologize for that. But I've encountered some of their writing and not nearly in the same depth that you and Eli have gone into. And I guess my initial reaction was I was and am sympathetic to the billionaire critique and to some of the way we can get into what the elements of TESCREAL are. But I was sympathetic with that aspect of it, that in some ways, some of these ways of thinking, in my view, have been misapplied and dangerously so by, I hate to generalize, but by what you might call the billionaire Silicon Valley set. However, I thought they were also lumping together some very discrete ideologies, and that it might have been better if they had approached their research as anthropologists and said, what is it about tech valley billionaires that makes them use these different ideas in a certain internal way. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's just start with one of them, cosmism, which I think is the most amusing example that they tried to pull in, which was a revolutionary idea in Russia that the goal of society should be resurrecting all the dead with technology. And that idea then influenced other Russian thinkers, some of whom were Bolsheviks, who didn't see any conflict between projects like turning humans into cyborgs in order to colonize space and things like that. Yeah, that idea had some resonance in Russian circles. And there's one computer scientist who's written a cosmism book 10, 12 years ago. And there's one quote by Elon Musk of a cosmist, a guy who was a cosmist, also an astrophysicist. And so on that thin web of evidence, you then weave together, cosmism is a theme that runs through all of Silicon Valley. Well, not really. And what we point out in the essay is the people who do call themselves cosmists are in Russia and part of Putin's circle and despise everything that is in the TESCREAL bundle. They despise transhumanism, they despise liberal individualism, they despise transgenderism, etc. So it's like, okay, what are you saying when you say that cosmism is one of the toxic ideas in Silicon Valley? Yes, some very few Silicon Valley people have thought about cosmism, but that's all you can really say. Yes, and as on your point about billionaires, this is something we come back to again and again in the essays. Look, billionaires always interpret the ideas of their time, whatever ideas they're attracted to, they interpret them in ways that are self-satisfying and self-congratulatory. And we point out the resonance with Darwinism. Darwinism was adopted by the left. Darwinism was also adopted by the right. The Darwinism of the right that captains of industry were attracted to was the one that said they were allowed to make money in whatever way they wanted as long as they gave away enough to hospitals and bridges and so forth. And that's one of these ideas in this bundle is effective altruism. What's the best way to help people? And yes, billionaires tend to interpret that in the most self-congratulatory way and to rationalize their greed and their occasional philanthropy. And the rest of us get to interpret it in whatever way we want. And if you attack the idea that we should rationally be trying to figure out how to improve the world, which is the basic idea there, then what's the left with?
Right. I mean, the entire premise of the left in general and socialism specifically for hundreds of years now, or more, 200 years, has been to analyze the problems of society and come up with solutions. And I think, the the cosmism, that's just out there. I've been aware of cosmism for a long time because when I was a student, I was very interested in Russian history, Russian philosophy, particularly 19th, earliest 20th century. And I was amused when a few people in Silicon Valley picked it up because, it's an interesting, of course, it's fascinating. It's filled with fascinating ideas, but it has a little bit of a taint of something you might do if you dropped acid, and think everything's alive, So,
right. You just finished your Eastern Orthodox catechism, and now you need to drop some acid.
Right, exactly. And now, as for you were talking about effective altruism, for example. I do think there is a point very early on where it can become ruthless or so dispassionate as to be dangerous.
Well, one of the things that Timnit Gebru and Phil Torres and the many people now who are repeating their conspiratorial arguments, one of the things that they reflect is postmodern critique, which is they attack rationalism as being at the core of the logophallocentrism that drove imperialism and racism and gender inequality, et cetera, et cetera. They also attack utilitarianism, or the idea that you can judge morality by its consequences. And utilitarianism has 250 years of complaints against it, which it has not ignored, right? It's like if you say, oh, utilitarians are able to rationalize bad means on the basis of good ends. Yeah, they figured that out 250 years ago, and they've been trying to figure out what to do about that. But is there another way to think about how to achieve the good other than consequentialism? There are a couple others, and they're not left-wing solutions. So,
well, and right, and let's think for a second, James Hughes, about a couple of those. Rationalism, for example, the part of their argument, I'm sure somebody will get upset with me at this point, but the notion that rationalism is a white male phallocentric imposition on the other peoples of the world who are not, phallically oriented, let's say, to me is patronizing and disturbing. And it contains elements of a meaningful critique of our society, but it's implied in such a way that I think a lot of people, including a lot of people it supposedly defends, find offensive. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but I was surprised to see that among their critiques.
Right. I mean, if you say that rationalism, or the idea that rationality is important, has been used to justify the denial of suffrage to blacks and women, to colonial subjects, et cetera, you're absolutely correct. And the left's response was, no, they are rational. They're rational enough to be citizens, and they should have the suffrage. And the left never has, only occasionally, I should say, has only ever occasionally argued that the suffrage should be extended to children, or rights should be extended to rocks, or whatever the other consequences of that argument would be, because we recognize that it was legitimate to say they do have rationality. It is not legitimate to say that rationality is irrelevant in being a moral political subject. And so if the postmodernist critique takes you to the extreme that rocks should have a right to vote, then I just don't see how it helps us,
Right. Or nobody should have the right to vote.
Right.
And what I think the frontiers of the left are exploring now is the relationship, and I don't, just perhaps it's an aside, but the relationship between rationality and sentience or consciousness, such that where science and observation are beginning to reinforce the impression that people have had for millennia, which is that, for example, animals have conscious experience of their own existence, or many animals do. Debate about how far that extends, and therefore, animals shouldn't necessarily have the right to vote. They can't read. They can't, participate in civic society, but they do have certain rights. That is irrational. That's not rationalism. That's a rational analysis of the fact that with consciousness comes some rights to well-being. At least some of us believe that, right?
Right. And let's not lose sight of the fact that the church of rationality is extremely quirky, often comes up with people who argue for weird political or social ideas on the basis of them being perfectly rational, which we don't have to accept. But if you put it in the context of 200 years, since the French Revolution, people have been trying to replace religion with rationality. It doesn't work because reason and rationality don't tell us what to do. So it doesn't make a good church, and it doesn't make a good God. But the left has accepted for a very long time that self-reflection on what your cognitive biases are and trying to understand society in a rational way, for instance, to strip away all the mystifications that keep us trapped in capitalist society, that this is a core project of rationality, and that it's an intellectual virtue to try to do that, right? And so the fact that there are people out there in Silicon Valley, I would rather there be a quirky cult of rationality in Silicon Valley than a quirky cult of Wahhabism or Episcopalianism or whatever other ideology they could adopt. That's the least offensive, idea they could adopt.
Well, we could talk about that because I wonder, actually. All of this reminds me of an essay I've been meaning to write for years and taking notes of, and we were talking before we began the interview about cycling back and forth between politics and broader ideas. But one of the things I struggle with about rationality, and why I think perhaps their argument has resonated with some people is not because it's right, not because rationalism, it's as a principle, or even utilitarianism, or another one we can talk about, long-termism. It's not because there's anything inherently wrong with them, but like all philosophies, I mean, I think Wahhabism is inherently wrong, actually, but like most worldviews, it can be taken to brutal extremes, and it can be applied in ways that demean our or damage our core as human beings. I mean, I could perform an analysis that says if I kill all the children on my block, it will be in the long-term interest of humanity, therefore I should do so. But I would be a monster if I did that, because I would be relying on my own intellect and favoring it over what human instinct and common sense and the checks and balances that evolution, among other things, is built into our nervous systems has done to prevent us from doing monstrous acts. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Absolutely. And I think, again, these questions of, what kinds of constraints should one put on one's calculations so that you don't start rationalizing monstrous acts? That's a question that utilitarians or consequentialists have asked for a very long time. I think the principal thing that Eli and I were trying to do is to say, look, the left needs to think about the future in a serious way. And we are both dismayed that so much of left debate, at least here in the United States, is about a 20th century paradigm of, reform versus revolution, or, industrial jobs, and, whether it's best to organize Starbucks or industrial jobs or something. They're not thinking about a fully automated luxury communist future. They're not thinking about a future with genetic enhancement and all the questions that brings. So we're saying we need to think about these things. These domains, if you say that any consideration of these topics, which Gebru and Torres have had, if you could say that any consideration of these topics and trying to contest on the terrain of struggle of these various ideological debates is intrinsically reactionary, then we will never be able to think seriously about the future. That's one thing. And the second thing is that, look, it's a structural analysis. If you get sucked into the idea that, that because people met at Davos, and at Davos, the World Economic Forum gave this paper that was so racist that all people who have ever been associated with Davos and all those people are tarred by this one paper, that's just not good structural analysis. The structural analysis would be, we need to break up their monopolies, take away their money, and reduce their political power. Right. And it really doesn't make any difference which ideas they happen to adopt at the moment.
Well, and I think that makes your critique especially important, because if the left abandons debate about these long-term issues of the future, as we're now seeing with the rapid increase in the use of so-called AI technology, for example, but also the internet itself and all sorts of technological and biomedical advancements we've seen. If the left cedes that ground by saying any debate on these issues rather is inherently reactionary, we're in effect ceding the future to the people with whom we disagree. I assume you would agree with that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk a little bit about transhumanism.
Okay.
I think you and I, because one of the things they criticize, transhumanism, and it certainly gets a bad rap these days in a lot of corners from left to right. But transhumanism, an idea, a system of thinking that believes we will eventually, using technology and science, transcend the limits of humanity as our human existence, individual and collective, as we understand them today. I mean, that's a fair summary of transhumanism, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I first encountered it 30 years ago with the extropians, who were a libertarian version of transhumanists. And eventually I became the executive director of the World Transhumanist Association, which was very fractious because we had very diverse politics, and I was a socialist and open about that. And my project was always, look, here's the socialist transhumanists and here's the libertarian ones. We have some things in common and we have other things we absolutely do not. And one of the reasons we started the IET was to carve out the space for a left-wing transhumanism, or originally that was the project. And the people who at least agreed there should be a state and that states should do things like regulate, not all transhumanists agreed with that. So, for someone then to come in and say all transhumanists are reactionary eugenicists, it's like, okay, haven't we been friends for 10 years, Phil?
Right. I mean, you and I and some others had dinner with him, as I recall, which I think breaking bread is a sign of friendship. I'm trying to think of how to approach it. So let me just take a minute first, if I may, and just talk about my own relationship with transhumanism. I think you and I probably met 15, 20 years ago at one of those transhumanist conferences where I gave a talk after I'd written a couple things. And I remember at dinner, I was sitting next to one of the people you referred to in your essay with Eli, and she, not by name, but you referred to her husband, some others by name. She turned to me and said, so are you a transhumanist? And I said, do you identify as a transhumanist, or words to that effect? And I said, no. And she said, so you mean that means you're not a transhumanist? And I said, no, it doesn't. And she said, well, then what do you plan? She said, then what are you? What are you going to do? And I said, well, as new technologies are developed, I guess the next indicated thing as we learn they're coming, and to keep talking about and debating these ideas. So that's kind of where I stand on it. And I guess I would also say, in terms of my approach to transhumanism, that at that session, I wish I still had what I wrote up, because I did a lot of research in it. Because I started out, I think I had all the chemical derivations, scientific derivations. I said, I woke up this morning, introduced a substance into my body in a coffee cup that alters the state of my nervous system and my brain function. I placed lenses over my eyes composed of this chemical that increases my vision. I listed like 10 or 15 things, got in my car and drove here to talk about whether or not we're ever going to be transhumanists, meaning that we are transhuman already in the context of 500 years ago. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think in a sense, transhumanism is anti-transhumanism, pro-transhumanism, in a way, is a failure to recognize that we're constantly enhancing ourselves. What do you think about that idea?
Oh, well, I usually start the story back with fire, because it was at least some anthropologists, some paleontologists believe that once we invented fire, we were able to eat enough calories to allow our prefrontal cortex to grow, and therefore we've been kind of co-evolving with our own technology ever since. And it really doesn't make any difference as long as you don't say that it starts just tomorrow. That our current state of being is the ideal, optimized, evolutionarily perfect form, and that anything we do from here on in is change, because we've been changing a lot. But this. Right. I should make another parallel here, which is that I became a socialist when I was 19, I guess. I was a yippie before that. I don't know exactly what you call that. But when I was 19, one of the arguments was, look, why don't you call yourself an economic Democrat instead? Because socialism has so much baggage. There's so many, there's 250 years of people you have to defend when you get into that argument. And it's like, okay, Michael Harrington said at the time, look, you could advocate for trade unionism and world government and nationalizing industry and redistributive taxes and universal health care. And guess what they're going to call you? They're going to call you a socialist, because that is where you fit in the history of ideas. And you can run away from it and you can deny it as much as you want, but you actually are one. Now, then, if you don't like these other kinds, you can start refining it and saying, I'm not that kind, I'm this kind. I'm democratic socialist, I'm not a Stalinist. And so when I approached these sets of ideas, I thought, well, let's do the same thing. There's the democratic or the left-wing transhumanism, and then there's the right-wing one. And we can start having that debate because, I actually am a transhumanist.
So, and what does that mean to you? I guess is the best way to, yeah.
Well, it means that you accept that humanity is a long evolving thing, that it has amorphous boundaries, the boundaries between us and other species, for instance, now that we know about Homo naledi and Neanderthal genes got into ours and all that kind of stuff. It has boundaries with other animals, that the cognitive, if you try to define personhood on the basis of cognition, perhaps great apes should have rights. It will have boundaries with transformed humans that have robot stuff in their head, and it will have boundaries with robots. And if you start saying only something born of a man and a woman with the right kinds of genes shall ever have these rights, that's not going to lead us very far in the future when we're confronting people and things that have all the things that we think you'll probably actually need. So that's part of it. But I would say the other aspect of transhumanism is that it starts with the quotidian day-to-day details of making decisions that are not transcendent, becoming post-human gods. It's like, should I replace my daily insulin shots and blood testing with an internalized artificial pancreas?
Right.
Who has an objection to that? Really?
Right,
seriously?
exactly. No, that's my point too. That yeah, I think it was you, James Hughes, that told me about a study that showed, for example, that I think with fundamentalist Christians are more likely, they talk about if you're going to die, it's God's will, but they're more likely than other people to use life extending
right.
Medical intervention.
They believe in hell and their word.
Right. Yeah, I guess. Which to me, look, it's just human nature. I mean, I don't fault them in their moment of facing mortality for saying, I'd like to be around a little longer. We're built. I was going to say we're programmed for that. That might be controversial language, but I mean, evolution has designed us to want to stay alive, and the bonding that we experience through love and other things designs us to make want to spend more time with those we love. So I don't fault them, for using that technology, but it says to me that, in a sense, and I guess this is why I struggle with the term, that we're all transhumanists in one way or another at some point or another in my life. When I put on glasses, which I have to do to read, sometimes I'm a transhumanist. I've had hearing loss, hearing defects since childhood. I've worn hearing aids a long time. That's transhumanist to me. We could go on and on, but that's the idea, and that. To me, it's more an attitude of approaching technological change that affects ourselves without fear, and two, anticipating the changes that might come in order to make sure they occur in the most democratic and just way possible.
Well, let me just point out some connections between the rest of the ideas, which is that for leftists with a materialist orientation, technology has long been assumed to be one of the drivers of history. And the singularitarians are people who think that the accelerating trends of technology are going to lead to a point of social disruption soon, within this century, that will be so profound that we really probably don't understand what is going to, any of the things that could happen after that point. Okay, so that's radical uncertainty about the future. There are also people that are in this critique called long-termists who are trying to think about what's it going to be like in the year 1 million or 1 billion AD, and how many of our descendants will there be, and what are the best things that we can do for our descendants. And as long as their conclusions are just don't blow ourselves up, fine. Yeah, we all agree, right. Don't blow ourselves up. But if you get anything beyond that, you're probably in wildly speculative and uncertain territory. And so I just think the internal contradictions within this are very interesting. It's like Marx is saying, should we be planning for what socialism will look like in 2100? And Marx was like, oh, don't worry about that, because the people then are going to figure it out. The best we can.
I refuse to make menus for the cook shops of the future, said Mark.
Exactly. So what we need to do is focus on the moment and making the moment as good as possible, so that tomorrow will be as good as possible.
Well. Exactly, but just briefly on each of those, singularitarianism, to me, that there's going to be this singularity and that we mere mortals can't understand it. I don't see the evidence for it. I mean, in the way some people describe that post-singular world, we just wouldn't be able to understand its day-to-day operate. We couldn't even be Phil Hartman as the caveman lawyer. I'm just a simple caveman. We just would be irrelevant. It seems to me like a wish fulfillment fantasy on the part of technologists. But long-termism is important, I think, in this context, because I think you put it right. As long as let's keep going, so that if there's an opportunity, if that for humanity to exist in a billion years, and create type 5 civilizations or whatever. But to me, where it gets monstrous, I mean, this is the extreme example of it. There are all sorts of gradients of it. Where it gets monstrous, long-termism to me is, if I let you do this liberal thing of giving people health care, that's going to inhibit the research needed to help trillions of people in the future. So let's let millions of people die now to save trillions of people in the future, which to me is arrogant, grotesque, foolish, unjustified by anything other than speculation. You've seen that kind of thing too, haven't you?
Yes, of course. And I came out of religious sociology. My bachelor's thesis was on Pentecostalism. I studied to be a Buddhist monk. And so the parallels between the religiousness of these fields for me was always apparent and not problematic. If you're a complete rationalist and you think there's any whiff of millennialism or apocalypticism or utopianism is damning, then yeah, I understand why you think that, but I don't think so. I think this is a perennial human impulse to transcendentalize, and when you think about the radical future. But where do you take that critique? And this is where Phil Torres emerged. Is one of the reasons I supported his work, is that he started doing the same thing. He started doing religious comparisons of religious eschatology to the way people are thinking about things. And I think that that's correct. And some people within the singularitarian community exhibit very cultic behavior because they have come to the conclusion that the robot God is coming, and we have to make sure to propitiate them, and we have to make sure not to, do anything that will impede their ascension. That's just religious thinking. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, the ultimate fruition of it, as I've seen it, and a couple of people has alluded to, and I think maybe Teilhard de Chardin or something, but there's the physicist, I'm blanking on his name, who wrote the long book about how the ultimate endpoint of technological evolution will be a computer so powerful that it can recreate everybody whoever lived, and that will be the afterlife. And right. I mean, but I guess in wrapping up all of this, Jay, it seems to me the problem isn't with these fields of thought, because fields of thought are open-ended. The problem is the way these fields of thought are applied, intersect with the world of the powerful billionaires who have so much influence over the rest of us in obvious ways like political contributions, and less obvious ways like the technology they design and what it does to us. I mean, they're already they're already doing transhumanist work on us by making us click over and over, by creating these biochemical responses to technology. But the danger is the way that the kind of thinking that's prevalent in those circles uses these ideas to amplify itself out in the world of power and human relationships. That's my conclusion. What's yours?
I would say if Eli and I were going to extend this into a full book-length treatment of the subject, one of the things that we would have to address is the financial and human and personal ties that are being alluded to in this conspiracy theory. One of the reasons the IET is small compared to some of the other institutions in this domain, like the Future of Humanity Institute and so forth, is that because we had a radical political mission, or at least a left of center political mission from the beginning, we did not attract Peter Thiel's money or Elon Musk's money or James Martin's money or whoever. We were too ideological. That was intentional, and in retrospect, good for us. We never got tainted by this dirty money from these other places, at least to our knowledge, the few philanthropists.
Epstein never kicked in, huh?
Yeah, Epstein. I never got invited to the island.
Yeah.
So good for us, but yes, there are financial ties. And one of the things that the whole 20 years of trying to run a nonprofit has made painfully clear is it's not that you can't say things that they might not like. It's just that if you say too many of them, they're not going to give you the money, right? So there is a compromising function in the reliance of the NGOs, the nonprofits, and the academic institutions on big money, especially in the context of such extreme inequalities of wealth that have developed. Like half of the richest men in the world are from Silicon Valley. So yeah, some of their wealth is going to, just by, when they sneeze, they're going to be influencing the organizations and people around them. We have wanted the people in these fields to be more self-critical and more attentive to the ways that this distorts the message. And hopefully now they will be. But not because they get attacked for being associated with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's not the helpful critique.
Right. We didn't even get to talk about conspiritualities or any of those, or enough about AI, which is a topic in and of itself. But a very important paper. I'm going to just find the headline right now. It's on Medium. You can find it. I can't find the thing. Conspiracy Theories, Left Futurism, and the Attack on TESCREAL. James Hughes, Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. Is that IEET.org? Is that the website?
That is the one, yes.
Well, thanks for writing this stimulating piece. And as always, great talking to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is Zero Wallet.